Welcome. Today we are going to talk about David Hume. For some, Hume is a hero, an archetype of modern philosophy, where we kind of move entirely out of the medieval era, kind of rejecting even as far as Descartes went, although Hume was an admirer of Descartes. Uh, for others, Hume is a villain, uh, the one who brings about the horrors of modern philosophy. Still others just kind of see him a little bit as a fool, as somebody who's a little too haughty and a little bit of an idiot because he took things a little too far. That's where I am. I'm really kind of in that last category. And we'll kind of understand why, and I'll explain it all here shortly. But again, today we're talking about David Hume. Hero, villain, or kind of somewhere in between, but not maybe as smart as he thinks he is. These are kind of the options that we have with Hume in ways that we didn't really serve with others. David Hume lived from 1711 to 1776. He's a Scottish nobleman and empiricist philosopher. Empiricism becomes that school of thought following David Hume that rejects, in many ways, ideas and only values experience. Now, this is a very broad way of kind of drawing this out and explaining it. But while for people like Descartes with rationalism, there were these ideas that we can move on to and proceed from, and then lets us understand our experience after this. For people like Hume, our ideas are likely what's faulty, and if it's not based primarily and first on our experiences. Again, we have this sort of rejection of Bonaventure, this rejection of even understanding things from ideas and how this relates to our experiences, that it starts from our experiences and moves forward from there. Major work would be his treatise on human nature. This was his first book in any real sort of sense in 1739 to 1740 when he wrote it. But this was not a popular work, and we'll explain that later. His real popular work that got him noticed by anybody was his volume of the history of England. Famously, he's also sometimes called by some the first atheist, which is not accurate. It's more agnostic is the correct title because he rejected the notions of atheism as overly simplistic and as faulty as any sort of dogmatic belief in religion. And we can kind of see some of this played out in his dialogues concerning natural religion. And we'll address all of these today. As far as his life goes, his father died when he was an infant, and he was raised by his mother. His father was a minor noble, a gentleman landowner, so he kind of grew up with having enough around him and having some connections. He was connected to the powerful, but really wasn't powerful himself. His mother was often critical of him as a young boy, especially what she referred to as his bookish tendencies. A quote once is that, "Oh, Davy's a fine, good-natured cratur, but uncommon weak-minded," would be kind of the way that she would say him. Like he spends too much time thinking instead of doing something. He'll attend the University of Edinburgh when he was 13 or 14 years old, go off there. He has a nervous breakdown, which the critics of Hume, like myself, always smile anytime somebody you don't really like as much has a breakdown. You're like, see, he couldn't even live with himself. It's a little cruel. It's a little bit much. I understand. I'll grant you that, and I'll explain my critiques of Hume as time goes by. But there's that. And of course, then what does he do? He goes off to France. While in France around 1734, he'll go to La Flèche, the same school that Descartes did, a major school in France. In France, he wrote what he believed was a new perspective in philosophy that he discovered. And this is where we are going to get those notions of empiricism out of. In France, he also associated with Andrew Michael Ramsay, 1686 to 1743, who was a Catholic mystic and teacher of Charles Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as sometimes referred to, who was a leader of the Freemasons. So we get all of that sort of group coming in there. His first work, the one that he thought was going to help him out, his treatise on human nature, 1739 to 1740, he thought was so brilliant. And see, this right here is also why I don't like him. He's so full of himself, right? We get this little like, I am so brilliant, I've discovered something new, everyone should love and admire me. And he was really wanting those accolades. So it's not just that he thinks he's smart. He's expecting others to recognize his brilliance, right? Again, just off-putting as far as some of this goes. So what did he do? He published it anonymously, hoping that there'd be such a stir of, oh, who is this brilliant man? Who is this genius? And maybe he'll address everything and we'll all be happy and solved. But it didn't create a sensation. He thought he was going to sweep in later and say, it is me. I am the new savior of the philosophical world. But everyone read it and they kind of didn't like it. It was ignored. They thought it was kind of foolishness. And you know, a lot like some of us think of Hume overall. He thought it answered all the questions that Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Bayle, all these other people were asking. He thought, I have now solved it. And maybe it did from his perspective. Other people just didn't like it. In fact, it will keep him from getting several different jobs. He kind of casually mentions that it was him hoping that it would maybe engender some influence and make it important, and nobody cared. In fact, what it did is it kept a couple of people from like, I don't like you, you're not getting a job here, and it barred him from some spots in teaching philosophy. So he kind of had a couple of different jobs. He was a caretaker. He was what's referred to as a mad nobleman or a tutor to a lunatic, kind of this sort of connection. Some crazy guy, and he would try to teach him and make some money. He spent time as a librarian. He was an aide-de-camp to a British general, good intellectual sort of job. But again, not really anything of what he wanted. So he decided, since I can't cut it as a philosopher, because nobody expected him and liked him, right? The jobs in Edinburgh and Glasgow where he wanted to teach, he was barred from. He decided, I should probably turn my attentions a little bit more to the English. And one thing that, 18th century English liked was the English. You hear that, right? We get all of this great grandiose thoughts about how England is the pinnacle of society at this time for a lot of people, right? The sun never sets on the English Empire. England has conquered the world. What do English want to know about? English want to know about the English. So he ends up writing a 6-volume history of England. And this was actually wildly popular. He wrote from the time of Roman conquest to 1688. And this would let him be, popular enough to become a diplomat in Paris, which is a pretty prestigious position, especially at this time. He'll retire and go off to Scotland later and reside as a, quote, man of letters, where he's kind of befriending other intellectuals and writing to them, people he would associate with and considered his intellectual friends. Would be like people like Benjamin Franklin, Adam Smith, Rousseau, and Diderot were all kind of in that sort of circle, where he would, I like this idea of yours. Have you thought about this? And they'd kind of, exchange brilliances, as it were, with one another. So this is kind of his life until he dies in 1776, likely kind of siding with some of the friends of his in America and liking some of the ideals of the American Revolution as well. But again, before any of this has formally taken place. Hume's real philosophical import comes in this first work of his major work. And while he would have some others, his dissertation on the passions, for instance, which we'll talk about later, and a few other things, the treatise of human nature really outlines his notion of empiricist philosophy and how we should understand the world around us, specifically how we need to understand our ideas and our perceptions of reality. He says that all that we are aware of is our impressions, our feelings, and all of our ideas. Right? Everything that we have is only our impressions of the world around us. In fact, all of these are just copies and compounds of our impressions. Even your ideas are really kind of based upon a copy of what you're perceiving around you. Again, everything that you have first finds its source in that world around us. We only know those ideas that resemble each other, are contrary to each other, and are degrees of quantity or number, right? Everything is always set about as in copies from what we perceive, and then always set one against another. This is Hume's perception of the world and how he thinks that we all see it. And broadly speaking, there's nothing horribly wrong with this idea. One of my old college professors, man, I used to sit with my master's, old Catholic priest at a Dominican university. He would absolutely hate me for even conceding a little bit to Hume. So look, I'm not that dogmatic, right? But this is the thought. This is the idea here, is that, you know, there is a little bit of truth that most of what we know, at least Hume says all, but a lot of it is all comparisons. It's all setting one thing over against another. And this is the way we shape everything. Hume says things are all broken about in notions of perceptions and impressions, right? Perceptions are, first of all, our impressions, those original experiences, and our ideas, which are the copies or memories of these impressions. Impressions themselves exist prior to and are more lively than our ideas. Right? If you put your hand on the table in front of you, assuming that you're sitting in front of a table, you're going to have immediate impressions. You're going to feel that it is smooth, likely that it's cool, right? And then maybe a couple of other things. Maybe it, unfortunately, might feel sticky or slimy, which would, right, immediately change what you're going to do that, right? But it's just your basic sensations of external sense data. These are your impressions. Before you go, I like this table, it feels nice, or it's sticky or slimy, therefore it's gross and I'm going to run away. Before you have ideas about it, your sensations are just giving you that raw data. Now again, this is very different than what we've found already with Descartes, and we'll find with Bonaventure, who precedes Descartes, that all of our sensations are then filtered through what we are expecting of that, right? This becomes the major deal for Descartes. For Descartes, apprehension was key, right? Apprehension is going to shape how we see our sensations, right? If I told you to touch the table and you already apprehended it as sticky, gross, dirty, unclean, right? Your sensations are going to be attracted to those things, according to Descartes, which will either confirm or deny that. You're going to say, oh, it's not quite as sticky as I thought. It looked gross and disgusting, but it doesn't necessarily feel that way. Maybe something else is causing this or shaping this, right? And we'll either think that it's worse or better than as it is. Hume disagrees with Descartes. He's going to say, first of all, our impressions are there, that it's our sensations of external sense data. And then it moves to reflections on our internal feelings. Then our emotions approach the sensations, as opposed to having notions of apprehension. Finally, for Hume, these are all copied by our memory or our imagination to form simple ideas. Our ideas are tables are of this sort and that sort and the other sort, right? There is no notion of tree or treeness in that same way for Hume, right? It's only sensations of a tree and reflections on our internal feelings and our emotions of that kind of like a tree, sure, why not? And then we're going to copy that into our imagination, and now we have an idea of a tree, right? We start with the impressions, then move to the ideas. He completely drops this Cartesian idea of apprehension, which, again, for Descartes was huge. And Hume thinks he's solving many of those problems by eliminating that sort of sense that you might start off with an idea and then form your perceptions and impressions after that. For Hume, it starts with the perception. There is no apprehension. Hume tells us, by the term impression, then I mean all our more lively perceptions. When we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. And impressions are distinguished from ideas, which are less lively perceptions, of which are conscious when we reflect on any of the sensations or movements above mentioned. Right? And he's going to continue and advance this a little bit more. It says there's two different kinds of impressions. There's sensation. This arises out of the soul originally from unknown causes, right? These sensations of external data. He says that's just kind of part of where we are, and he's not going to say where this is going to come from anymore. And reflection, he says, this is derived in great measure from our ideas, and that in the following order. Impressions first strikes upon the senses. This makes us perceive heat, smooth, hunger, thirst, cold, pain, etc. And then these are copied by the mind. This copy is the idea. Right? We don't actually then know impressions. We don't really have these original experiences except for fleeting. The rest of it is all just copies of it. And again, for me to, upset my old professor as well, there is some truth to this idea that ideas are copies of memories and impressions. Now, again, Hume's problem is he doesn't start with that first one, right? The chain of events is shorter. But many of the experiences you have are copies of that, right? You're not thinking of the last time that you did something. You're thinking of the last time you thought about the thing that you did. In many ways, this is part of the way your mind works. This is how a lot of different psychoanalysis therapies work, is that they change your memory pattern. And therefore you're thinking and changing your states of mind on event. This is why it's advised by good, for instance, sports psychologists that you end physical activity that you're doing with a good experience, right? If you're playing golf, you leave the driving range after you had a good hit, that you sunk the ball where you needed to, that you putted correctly, etc. That you don't stop when you're frustrated, when it didn't work. But you do it when you're doing well. You don't stop skiing when your last run was one that you fell down. You get back up and you go down, maybe even an easier run. But that way your impression of the whole day is off of something positive. Right? Just basic notions of sports psychology. If you fall off the horse, you get back on the horse. For an old-timey sort of expression on that same sort of event that kind of predates sports psychology. And there is some truth to what Hume is saying here, that our ideas are copies of these memories. And when you look back upon an event, if you have a good memory of it, largely because the last experience was positive, then you're going to be more apt to want to do this or to try in the future. If your memory is poor, because the last experience was poor, your reflections on this is going to be towards notions of aversion. And again, Hume's close to the right sort of path on this. Just the whole total chain of events is off on him, and therefore some of the other conclusions he has are things that I and others will disagree with. Now, maybe you agree with him. Maybe you don't think he's off. Maybe you think he's spot on and you love Hume. Then I'm going to irritate you because he's not at the highest on my list. He is for a lot of other people, but not me. Right? And so this is his notion of ideas. For Hume, a lot of this comes down to our connections of memory and imaginations. The faculty by which we repeat our impressions in the first manner is called the memory. Subsequent ideas are called the imagination. Imagination is when one joins two or more consistent ideas. It is a mixture of a composition of that which belongs to the mind and to the will. See, we also apparently have this will that Hume needs to address and talk about. For instance, famously, when we talk about a notion of a golden mountain, we have notions of gold and we have notions of a mountain. We take these two distinct, disparate ideas and we put them into our mind, and now we have an image in our mind of a golden mountain. But both of these are originally based not off of these ideas, but impressions or these original experiences we have of gold and of mountains, or some variation therein. Same could be applied to other things. Virtuous horse is another common example, right, where we have virtue and we have horse, and we're taking these two different ideas and putting them together, and that this becomes kind of the purpose of our imagination, and imagination becomes key to our shaping and constructing of these ideas. Hume argues that there's different type of knowledge and of reasoning that takes place. Again, part of the focus of all of this is how the mind works. He'll state that the mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their own connection with objects. Right? So we're not really connecting with the objects. You don't really know the horse and its virtue or not. You don't really know the golden mountain or any tree or any object on its own. You don't really have a connection. All you have is sensations and replaying of these sensations. This is your knowledge, right? Is from this basic idea of your imagination and memory taking place. The mind for Hume is really little more than a theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, maybe through that actual sensation or replaying of that sensation. And this is all interrelations of your ideas. Ideas are the sciences, geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, and they affirm what is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. And we have demonstrative reasoning here. Those that concern the relation of these ideas, right? For instance, you can demonstrate these without regard to anything else. And again, we have a certain sort of affinity to Descartes while he's relating to this, right? That maybe there is some sort of ideas that hold value, although he's not really going to spend most of his time there. For most of what we're going to perceive, it is not just geometry, algebra, arithmetic, and these sorts of science that is based upon our reasoning skills after we've had experience, right? But most things are matters of facts. Now, matters of facts are also known as opinions, which is really confusing because this is not how we generally talk about facts, right? We think of facts versus opinions as oppositions, right? It's either a true fact or it's a false fact, at which point it's not a fact at all. But for Hume, this is all the same, right? It's all opinion in this way. If it's not something that can just be affirmed, that's based upon something intuitively or demonstratively certain. And this is all really just kind of your thoughts on it, man. It's just your opinion, man. To quote the Big Lebowski, right? There is no evidence of their truth, even if it happens to be true. There's no solid evidence of it. Hume famously once said that the sun will not rise tomorrow, and that this statement is not less untenable, and implies no more of a contradiction than saying that the sun will rise tomorrow. Both statements, that the sun will or will not rise tomorrow, is, again, just an opinion. There's no actual facts or knowledge that we can say. Now you might say, well, I'm basing it upon science or these other sorts of ideas. But again, it's not really there. It's still an opinion. It might be an informed opinion. You might be having stronger ideas in the sciences, right? But for Hume, that's really kind of relegated to right math of what we were talking about. It's a different sort of understanding. Now, we also have notions of moral reasoning for Hume. And those are things that concern the matters of fact and experience. We say that we believe it based upon moral weight and not necessarily upon empirical knowledge. Hume argues that all reasoning concerning what's matters of fact seem to be founded in the relationship of cause and effect. Now, this is really important because for Hume, cause and effect is very problematic. This is really at root why I don't like Hume, and much of his other philosophy all comes out of the same sort of nature and vein. And many of you might go, I kind of liked Hume, and I thought you were being a little, harsh on him until now. And now you're like, okay, maybe I'm going to run away. Or, oh, maybe you're overstating it. Maybe, but I don't think so. All right. Hume states very clearly, we know no real connection between one thing and another. We only know that the idea of one thing is associated with the idea of another, and that the imagination easily passes between them. This is what Hume is doing. He is rejecting cause and effect. When you play pool, for instance, and you strike the cue ball into the one for a break, right? And you're expecting all of those balls to fly apart. You're assuming, maybe even more than just a little assuming, right, that all of the rest of the balls should move. In fact, if you were to vigorously strike the cue into the one and nothing happened, Hume says, of course. Well, you would say, no, this is rigged. Like, did you glue them together or what? Like, I'm definitely not putting money on this game, right? But Hume says, no, that you've made all of these associations. You've made all of these expectations. You never really see cause and effect. You see cause and cause and cause and cause and cause. You have no knowledge of the relation between the cause and the effect. You just see event. All of the rest of it is done in your mind, and you have no certainty of knowledge. All you have is that experience. Right? See, now you might see this fundamental difference between Descartes and Hume. Right? Descartes says you're going to start off with the mind. You're going to start off with expectations of how just basic reasoning is going to lead from one idea to another. Hume says, no, all you have is the experience. Right? By the way, Hume is going to apply the same thing to his proofs for the existence of God, but also in how he's going to address the passions, the human nature, and anything that is internal, anything that is a function really of your mind is going to be discounted. Right? Again, it's just as rational to say that the sun will not rise tomorrow as that it will. You only assume from your mind that this is going to be the case. You make logical assumptions based upon what you think is logical, but it's just your imagination at play. Most of you are not planning on gravity turning off in the next 10 minutes. You're not grounded, you're not anchored, you're not tethered. And maybe this got rid of all the dinosaurs. Maybe they just floated all off, right? Maybe this is the problem. Right? And only those, subterranean mammals were able to survive. Now, again, no one believes this, but it's just as rational of an assumption as anything else. Because all of the other things are inferences made in your mind. They are just matters of opinion, aka fact, for Hume, right? That we do not see events actually causing one another. You only perceive a sequence of impressions and ideas. You don't know if what you're going to experience in the past will happen again in the future. Causes and effects are discoverable not by reason, but by experience. And your experience doesn't actually tell you that one is the cause and one is the effect. Your experiences only tell you this happened, then that happened. Therefore, you cannot affirm this idea. No object, Hume says, ever discovers by the quantities which appear to the senses either the cause which produced it or the effects which will arise from it. Right? Your senses are not telling you this. Nor can I reason, unassisted by experience, ever give any inference concerning real existence and matter of fact. Right? This is, for me, the fatal blow with Hume. This is, for many, the problem of where Hume goes too far. He's consistent, which you have to give it to him, that at least he's consistent. He'll take an absurd idea and go all the way to the end with it. But this is part of why some people really like him. Again, some people, not me. You'll find others in the philosophy department love Hume. Not me. Not my instructors, etc. Right? This is how we should see it differently. And again, you have me as an instructor, so things are a little bit different. Again, people make casual inferences, a process which is neither rational nor evidential, rather only psychological, based upon fundamental features of our human nature. You only assume cause and effect because you need it to function. It's a psychological condition, not a reasonable one. As far as notions of cause, he says, an object precedent and contiguous to another is so united with it in the imagination that the idea of one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. Again, this is all functions of your mind. That there is no justification for this process is Hume's argument. That we cannot discover this connection, he says, we only presume it to exist. It's a presumption, not a rational conclusion. We cannot define an effect, he says, without first the cause. Thus the effects do not exist. And so here we see this strong skepticism with regard to reason. This further applies when we're going to talk about our notions of self. Hume says that there is no unified self. There's no unified you. You have memory and imagination. You have a series of sensations that are playing out in an imagination, but there's no unified self. When you look inside yourself, Hume says that you don't find any impressions of a continuous self, but only bundles of changing ideas. Every attempt to defend our belief in our personal identity, he says, falls before critical questioning. At least this is his argument. So there is no cause and effect for Hume. There is no self. There is no pre-existent rationality that's going to shape your experiences. There's just those experiences and then what proceeds after that. Since Hume doesn't believe in notions of the self or cause and effect, but only a series of sensations, and all knowledge is based off of these sensations, how does this apply to notions of God in general or religion? What can our sensations tell us about the divine? And so this is a pretty valid sort of question and line of thought that Hume has. The work Dialogues of Natural Religion will come out and be published in 1779. For those of you looking back and going, hey, didn't Hume die in 1776? Yes, he did. So the work comes out posthumously after he's died. In the work, we have three characters who are debating with each other. We have Demia, who's a dogmatist who defends the existence of God on an a priori grounds, right? That God exists, and we're able to reason to this before any experiences. Now, you should see immediately that this is not going to be a position that Hume is going to look upon very favorably, as Hume wouldn't hold that we have any a priori judgments whatsoever, and therefore they all have to be dismissed. This is kind of his starting point, right? As that empiricist, that all of our experiences give us ideas. Our ideas don't give us our experiences. There are no a priori grounds. So again, we might look upon this person a little bit more like an Anselm or a Descartes, if you'd rather. We have Cleanthes, who says that experience provides evidence for the existence of this God. Right, so we've got an a priori who's too far for Hume, and here we've got an a posteriori sorts of proofs, right? So we might not like those three proofs from Aquinas, but those last two, we might be able to go off of those and move here, right? And then we have Philo, who's a skeptic, who attempts to kind of rebut the arguments and push back all of these arguments from God, from anything of reason and experience. So this becomes the third sort of position. It's somebody who's rejecting or pushing back. Cleanthes states, look around the world, contemplate the whole and every part of it. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, which again admit of subdivisions to a degree beyond what human senses and faculties can trace and explain. So right, this is that basic sort of analogical teleological argument here, largely advanced by people like William Paley, who gives the famous sort of watch example. Many of you are probably somewhat familiar with Paley's watch analogy, is essentially saying that if you were out on a walk out in nature and you happen to come across a watch, you would naturally, from looking at the watch, assume a watchmaker. In fact, the more knowledgeable you are about the watch, the more certain you would have to be that hunks of metal didn't flatten and form gears and lay in certain levels on their own and happen to wind it and, you know, create different sorts of metals in different orders and different compositions and springs and all this other stuff on its own. Therefore, there has to be somebody who made this watch, possibly dropped it there along the path. And Paley's argument is the same is the case for the universe, right? When you look at a rock, you should actually have a very similar sort of argument to what you have upon the watch. The more you know it in the construction of all this, right? A rock might just simply be a rock, and it might have some sort of logical explanation to its case. But when you take the rock with the field, with the grass, with the composition, with its height, with its location, with everything around it, you would assume that there's some sort of orderly watchmaker who made the earth as well, and that a rock is not simply a stone that doesn't have any sort of intelligence maybe behind it, even though your first impression would be indeed that a rock wouldn't, while something as fancy as a watch would. The rock is a gear, as it were, in here, and therefore you need to take a step back and see all of that. Dima says that he could not approve of this conclusion concerning the similarity of a deity to men. Still less can I approve of the mediums by which you endeavor to establish it. What? No demonstration of being a god? No abstract arguments? No proofs a priori? We cannot accept... he's kind of pushing back, saying, why is it you can't do all of this? Are these which have hitherto been so insisted on by philosophers all fallacy and sophism? Can we reach no further in this subject than experience and probability? Very much challenging the ideas here of Cleanthes, who likes the a posteriori, and Hume, who would kind of find himself in there. I will not say that this is betraying the cause of a deity. Dima would prefer this sort of a priori argument, one from reason and not from experience. And so we see this sort of debate between the two. Filio ends up jumping in. Wherever you depart, in the least, from the similarity of causes, though, you diminish the proportionality, the evidence, and may at last bring it to a very weak analogy, which is confessed to be liable to error and uncertainty. See, this is a really interesting sort of point that this character is making here, right? That the problem with any a posteriori argument is that everything's in an analogy. And the farther away from the actual event that you're making an analogy of, it weakens the total claim. Right? To go back to Paley and to sort of criticize what we see here, a rock isn't a gear. Exactly. Right? I mean, you have to stretch it. You have to say, well, because of its composition, because of its formation, because of this, that, and the other, because of certain other practices, we have to kind of see it like springs, even though it's not a spring. It's like a spring. It's like a gear. It's not a gear. It's like a case, but it's not a case. And the argument here is that the farther away you get, the less sense the whole thing truly makes. And that this becomes the sort of challenge that we have to find ourselves in. That we need to make sure we're drawing consistent connections between the sort of analysis and the subject. That we cannot have an analogy go too far, because then it doesn't apply. As the work progresses, we end up getting a sort of questions about accepting this analogy that might be going too far. If we are trying to look at the world, the universe around us, as an analogy, as some sort of sign points to there being some sort of divine watchmaker, to again extend Paley's argument here, what does this actually tell us? And here we start to kind of see different characters advancing ideas of maybe where we go too far. Is that first, by method of reasoning, you'll have to renounce all claim to infinity and any of the attributes of the deity. This becomes one of the things, because again, notions of analogy, if the universe is finite, or our understanding is at least finite, how do you attribute notions of infinitude upon all of that? All you can get is that there's maybe something that's a little older, but notions of infinity need a different sort of argument. You don't get that from experience. Now, you might have an a priori argument that necessitates a first mover because we can't logically go back to infinity, and I would probably say that would be a good argument, but Hume rejects a priori arguments outright. Right? They're just pushed away. They are dismissed because their nature is that they're based in reason and not experience. And so we're stuck with experience cannot give us anything of infinitude, because we're not infinite, nor is our knowledge of the universe infinite. And therefore, we cannot really hold notions of the infinite to God if all we're using is a posteriori arguments of any stripe. Second, he says that you have no reason on your theory for ascribing perfection to the deity, even in this new finite capacity, or for supposing him to be free from every error, mistake, incoherence in his undertakings. Because the universe, the world around us, yourself, has flaws, you can't really say, well, God is therefore perfect, if all you're doing is basing things off of this experience, that this doesn't work. This has to be rejected. This consequence cannot be a logical conclusion of what you know and what you see. Right? Maybe there's more than one world that's screwed up, even if this world looks good. Therefore, right, that you could be looking at that wrong. Your experience is too limited to be able to say anything towards moral perfection. Next, we have a challenge as far as the unity of the deity. A great number of men join in building of a house or a ship or rearing a city in framing a commonwealth. Why may not several deities combine in contriving and framing a world? This is only so much greater similarity to human affairs. Right? If we're looking at what we do and looking at what we do as kind of the archetype for what the deity might do as this watchmaker, we don't know by finding a watch if there's one watchmaker or 30 or 2 or 100. We don't know if every part was fashioned by a different individual and placed together in a series of others. We don't know if this was some sort of factory assembly line condition or if it was one artisan who did it all. Therefore, we can't really even claim notions of an imperfect, finite God being singular and not plural who made this world. These are challenges. Now, again, you might have great a priori arguments to challenge this, but Hume rejects those. Those are all put out. So we have a different source and scope for the arguments if we accept it on these grounds. Continues on in part 6 with some other possibilities. Damia says, to all the purposes of life, the theory of religion becomes altogether useless, and even with regard to speculative consequences, its uncertainty, according to you, must render a totally precarious and unsatisfactory. Right? We're not happy with the way things are working out. This is the sort of challenge that the dogmatist, the a priori theologian, philosopher ends up holding while challenging others, is saying, you've pretty much made everything useless because you're not willing to accept these other arguments. Filio ends up saying, now, if we survey the universe so far as it falls under our knowledge, it bears a great resemblance to an animal or an organized body, and seems actuated by like principles of life and motion. So we're going to have maybe even a different perception. Maybe it's not like a machine, but more like an animal. The world, therefore, I infer, is an animal, and the deity is the soul of the world, actuating it and actuated by it. Right? So we almost get this notion of animism more than creation, as far as what we might conclude just by looking at the universe. Right? If we're limiting ourselves to a posteriori arguments, if we can have no proofs a priori, then maybe we're left with the idea that the universe is an animal and that the God might be the soul. But that's a maybe. Could also be multiple. It could be, random luck. It could be all sorts of other things that we might be left with as far as the conclusions if we follow Hume. As we're seeing the main problem with restricting our proofs for the existence of God solely to the realm of a posteriori, only based upon our observations and experience without notions of reason to at least guide these, we're left with maybe one God, maybe multiple gods, a finite, maybe good, maybe not good God. Maybe God's just a soul of an animal, maybe not. Maybe there's multiple souls. Maybe they're fighting against each other. Maybe there's a good soul and a bad soul. And we're left with just random speculation that doesn't give us any sort of justification because our experiences don't tell us enough, because they are limited, and what we're trying to talk about is something that is not limited. So Demia, of course, wants to push back. Right? He says, can't we look again at a priori arguments? He says, because we need to understand and agree that eternal chains are by necessary rubbish, that we can't just accept this idea of things going on for all of infinity as far as a source for this world. We can't go that this is an infinite world, etc., that we can just go back to chains and chains. There must be something outside of our experiences. Right, that a chain is not determined or caused by anything, and yet is evident that it requires a cause or a reason as much as any particular object which begins to exist in time. We must therefore have recourse to a necessarily existent being who carries the reason of his existence in himself, who cannot be supposed to not exist without an express contradiction. And this being, of course, is the deity or the God. Right, very much clearly going back to Aristotle and Aquinas on these. That other options also for, in this sort of weird limbo where we can't hold a priori arguments or hold them, at least suspect, we're kind of stuck with the idea that nothing could cause something because we don't know what was there and now we have something, but we all know logically that nothing cannot cause something, that stuff always has a cause, that you have eternal causes of the universe is supposed to be out there forever. It isn't really supposed to hold any validity either. And we all know that chance is a word without any meaning. Yet this is all pushed back again to push everything back to that a priori principle, that nothing is demonstrable unless the contrary implies a contradiction. Nothing that is distinctly conceivable implies a contradiction. Therefore, you can think of anything and it's not inconceivable. It doesn't have a contradiction implied in it, even though it might contradict your a priori conceptions of the way things go. There's no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. Consequently, there is no being whose existence is demonstrable. We can't prove anything exists because you could all simply not exist. This is at least where our knowledge of events goes from. Hume proposes this argument is entirely decisive and is willing to rest the whole controversy upon this idea. Right? So again, this becomes the sort of challenge that we have, that nothing is demonstrable unless the contrary implies a contradiction. There's nothing that is distinctly conceivable that implies a contradiction. It's kind of taking that ontological argument from the opposite perspective and trying to prove it that way. He said it is observed by arithmeticians that the products of 9 compose always either 9 or some lesser product of 9. If you add together all of the characters of which any of the former product is composed, thus 18, 27, 36, 1 plus 8, 2 plus 7, 3 plus 6, all equal 9. 369 as well, 3 plus 6 plus 9 equals 18, which equals 1 plus 8, which equals 9. This is fantastic. So to the superficial observer, so wonderful a regularity may be admired as the effect either of chance or design. But a skillful algebraist immediately concludes it to be the work of necessity and demonstrates that it must, for every result, from the nature of these numbers. Right? This, you might say, oh, there's some sort of mystery behind this number 9 product thing. It's really kind of neat. It's novel. But he says this is just built into it. This is just what is the case, that it doesn't need some sort of design if it just simply is. So we almost get to that Bertrand Russell sort of critique that the universe just is, right? That it's just here. This is just the way that it is. It is conducted by like necessity, though no human algebra can furnish a key which solves this difficulty, right? That the economy of the universe is like this number 9. May it not happen that could we penetrate into the intimate nature of our bodies, that we should clearly see why it is absolutely impossible they could never admit to any other disposition. That the idea of necessity is dangerous, right? He says, dangerous is this idea of necessity. So we end up having this is so challenging, right? He says, so dangerous is it to introduce the idea of necessity into the present question. And so naturally does it afford an inference directly opposite to the religious hypothesis. We don't want to go too far. The problem is the idea of necessity and not that of the conclusion. Is it impossible to conceive of something? Doesn't necessarily mean that one idea exists or not. Could we perceive it to be impossible for the deity to not exist, for twice 2 to not be 4? It is evident that this cannot happen. It is still be possible for us at any time to conceive the non-exist, all right? Nor can the mind ever lie under the necessity of supposing object to remain always in being, in the same manner as we lie under a necessity of always conceive twice 2 to be 4. The words, therefore, necessarily existence have no meaning, or which is the same thing, none which is consistent. This is the challenge that he wants to say. So where are we left after the dialogues here? That no proofs work in establishing any concrete ideas of the deity, that we cannot prove that a deity exists, nor can we prove it doesn't, that we can't prove the nature of this deity, that we can't prove that there is only one deity, that we cannot prove this deity's outside creator rather than simply here. Yet Hume still recognized that it is reasonable, and that reasonable, intelligent people find themselves led to a belief that there must be some sort of designer of the world. He's not saying it's an unreasonable argument to hold. Again, Descartes really liked, or Hume really liked Descartes, sorry. And therefore, we can't reject this because my hero kind of liked this. So I'm going to kind of live off of his coattails, right? Hume is really not the father of atheism, and anyone who says this is an overzealous atheist. Usually he just wants to go, look, here's our archetype, here's our early hero, look how we dismantled all these other things. He's an agnostic. He's saying, I can't define anything. To be a philosophical skeptic is, in a man of letters, the first and most essential step towards being a sound and believing Christian, he says also in the dialogues. Famously, in Paris, Hume dined with the avowed famous atheist Baron de Holbach and a dozen of his friends. Hume expressed his opinion that no reasonable person could be an atheist at this dinner party, and the Baron replied that it was too bad that he felt this way since he was dining with 13 of them. All right, so we do have this other sort of fun exchange between this idea. We spoke a little bit about Descartes and his notion of the passions, and so we'll conclude by addressing Hume and his dissertation on the passions as well. He says the present theory of the passions, for him, the present theory of Descartes, depends entirely on the double relations of sentiments and ideas, and the mutual assistance of these in relation to provide for each other, as we discussed before. The virtues, talents, accomplishments, and possessions of others make us love and esteem them. That is because these objects arouse a pleasing sensation related to love and also have a relation or connection with the person. Just like Descartes, the virtues or the good passions are grounded in our relation of the person to the object. And again, this is really best understood through Bonaventure in that discussion, which we'll address later, of the journey of the mind into God. But when we order the passions is reversed, the same effect, Hume points out, does not follow, that we may pass easily from love and affection to pride and vanity. And so let's take a quick pause from Hume to understand Hume here. So I want you to quickly state in your mind the opposites of the things that I'm going to mention. The opposite of white is black. The opposite of up is down. Good. The opposite of dog is, oh, I know what y'all said, a cat. Why is it that the opposite of white is black, up is down, and dog is cat? Why is the opposite of dog not snake? The opposite of up not blue? Why is it not right or left? East, west? Why does it have to be down? This is a really interesting sort of idea that will relate back to Hume, so indulge me for a moment, right? Each of these have a category, a color, a direction, or something, right? The domestic animal. Each of these share nearly every quality except for one essential difference. This is why we call an opposite. For this reason, that other divisions and cultural distinctions will be made manifest, right? If we're in a different culture, we might have a different answer to what the opposite of a dog is. But for the broad American culture, the opposite of a dog is a cat. Because these are the two most common pets, and we think of these, and we usually even think of them as kind of antagonistic or something else, right? You're either a dog person or a cat person, even though many people have both. But you're one or the other, and that's going to tell me a certain something about you if you're one or the other. Right? And it's through the dialogue that we're going to face these sorts of divisions and understand things, right? That opposites are similar in nearly every way, except for one, and that this is going to shape and perceive our understanding of that. That the opposite is the opposite because it differs on the same sort of relation. Opposites are the most similar. That's why they are the most opposite, which is odd, but this is kind of the way that they are. For a while, I lived in Iowa. And Iowa, for those of you who don't know, is the -- corn and pork producing state in the nation. Or at least most years it is. Depends on, maybe something will change. And Iowans loved to kind of poke at Nebraskans, who are often the #2 in those productions. The states are both rather similar. One large city, one major college town, lots of farmland, both Midwest towns, both similar sorts of groups of people, and both are very fine. And but yet Iowans love to dig at Nebraskans, and I've known many a fine Nebraskan as well. But you end up getting this sort of like, why? Why is it I'm going to make fun of you? Why is it I'm going to tease you? Because I'm so similar to you. Because we share this sort of relation. Now, if you actually get out of, say, Des Moines and you go into the south of Iowa, you get a little bit of like, oh, we're looking down at Missourians. But that's, again, because of you're that close. And really, they're not thinking of all of Missouri. They're thinking of northern Missouri, right where they're at. Right? The opposites, those who you are most antagonistic to, are similar in every way but one. And this is even how the passions are to be understood for Hume. Right? Hume says this explains why objects appear large or small only by comparison with those of the same species. A mountain doesn't magnify or diminish a horse in our eyes, but when a Flemish and Welsh horse are seen together, one appears larger and the other smaller than viewed on its own. For those of you unfamiliar, this is not a picture of a Welsh and Flemish horse that you're seeing. It's a Clydesdale and a pony. But again, the idea of scope is always here in relation, which does go back to, Hume's ideas at the very beginning as well, that the way that we understand things is always in relation with one to another, right? That the mind is, we have this idea of everything being in shape and relation to one and another, that this is the faculty of reflection, right? That this becomes part of all of this is the way that this is done before it becomes copied by our mind, right? That we have this idea of how big it is and shape always in relation to one another, and that this is how it should be. This is why if I was to simply show you one of these horses, you wouldn't know if it's particularly big or small, but when they're next to each other, then they are indeed very obviously something that is different. And so that is an important distinction to make with Hume. This plays within even our own understandings on how we see ourselves and these passions, as were discussed by Descartes. He's going to tell us that things like envy arises from the superiority in others, but what arouses it is not the great disproportion between ourselves and the others, but on the contrary, our proximity. That we are going to envy and hate not people who are better than us, but people who are most like us. That when we cannot break this association, we feel a stronger desire to remove the superiority, or the one who is superior. This seems to be the reason why travelers, he says, though commonly lavish their praise on the Chinese and Persians, take care to depreciate nations that are near to their native country and may be rivals to it. This is why Iowans might kind of jokingly insult, play with, etc. Nebraskans. I'm sure Nebraskans do it with their own host of people, possibly even Iowans as well. But I didn't live in Nebraska, I lived in Des Moines. And so we have different sorts of ideas and relations within all of that. That we have this notion of comparison, and the closer you are is when you are going to end up having your passions excited, your minds and your perceptions, because they are bigger or more grandiose than you. If you were to be a concert pianist, I would say, wow, that's fantastic. I would have no envy in you because I'm not. I'm not an amateur. I'm not a quasi, I'm not second chair and you're first or whatever, and this sort of thing. I would just admire you for your talent. I'd probably not even fully understand how talented you are because of my non-familiarity with that. But if you were to, sit here and start challenging me and say, I dislike you on X, Y, and Z, and your understanding of Hume is blah, 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 and we're arguing about that. And you might make a good point. I might go, I now dislike you because you made this good point, and therefore anger, envy, jealousy, etc. might arise. So that's kind of what he's trying to talk about. Where you're most similar is where you're going to have the greatest amount of conflict. And for Hume, this is an important understanding for our notions of the passions, just like it was important notions of apprehension were for Descartes. For Hume, it's proximity. So at the end of the day, what do we think of Hume? Is he a hero? After all, he does kind of show us, some of the advantages that our minds might have. Is he a villain because he's going to bring in all of the horrors of modernity and the idea that there might not be any basis for any of our ideas other than sensations in themselves? In fact, right, we might want to give him some credit for both of these. Is he an idiot? idiot would probably be a little bit wrong. It'd be a little bit too much. Maybe a pompous windbag. Maybe this is what we'd want to say of him. Or just kind of mistaken in one ideas or taking one idea and going too far with it. Or do you think he's right? Do you think that all the times that I stop and say, well, we have to kind of give Hume this, means that I should just accept Hume and like him? I'm not going to. The whole rejection of cause and effect is too much for me personally. That I think that there is a certain amount of ideas that actually matter and are important. I like to see myself as a scholar of ideas, and therefore I want these ideas to exist in one frame or another. Maybe not as much as some, but definitely more than Hume wants to allow for. I like the idea of reasons giving some sort of basis for arguments and not just experiences. I don't trust all of my experiences immediately, like Descartes says that we might want to be at least suspect with some of them because they've messed up from time to time. But then again, maybe Hume's right with some things. I don't know. You guys discuss it. You figure out amongst yourselves. Let me prejudice you a little bit, as I was by one of my former instructors. But this is the way that it goes, right? You pass ideas and what you like and what you dislike on a little bit more. So again, discuss. If you have questions, let me know.